People believe addiction is a disease in the brain. The story we hear is simple. Certain substances hijack that dopamine system, and once that happens, the person loses control. But the idea of addiction as a medical disease is surprisingly recent. For most of history, intoxication was treated as a sin or a vice, not an illness. So the episode asks a different question. When addiction becomes a diagnosis, did we discover scientific truth, or just translate an old moral judgment into medical language? And if addiction isn't simply a disease in the brain, what actually causes it? Drugs and addiction, an anarchist perspective, Dickie Dreads, and we're on part 29 of the video series in chapter 3, the natural urge to alter consciousness. Part 27, the need for altered states, psychology and neuroscience. This section turns to the quieter revolution that followed Prohibition's political ground, the moment when sin became a symptom, when intoxication was rebranded a disease. The invention of addiction was not a scientific discovery, but a moral translation, a new grammar for the same old control. Before the 19th century, drinkers were judged for vice, not illness. They were sinners, not patients. The gin craze and the temperance sermons spoke the language of damnation, not diagnosis. Yet as industrial modernity required more obedient bodies, punishment gave way to treatment. The addict replaced the drunkard. The asylum replaced the jail. What appeared as compassion was in fact refinement of power, the same management of behaviour with a softer voice. The key shift came when medicine adopted the moral script of religion and dressed it in a white coat. Psychiatry was born from this alliance. The physician-priest emerged, a figure who promised to cure the very impulses that society found inconvenient. As Courtwright notes, the first medical models of addiction coincide exactly with the rise of industrial discipline. Every hour spent intoxicated was an hour stolen from productivity. The drunk was no longer damned for offering God, but for offending God, but for offending the clock. By the early 20th century, the psychoanalytic era added new layers. Freud's theory of drives, he imagined desire as pathology. The unconscious, that strange landscape of repression and wish, was mapped like a minefield. Treatment meant rechanneling instinct into acceptable forms: work, family, nation. Pleasures still required permission. The addict was cast as one who had failed to sublimate. Later behaviourists would strip away even the psyche, reducing addiction to stimulus and response, craving and reward. Either way, control remained external. The language of disease softened the weight of sin, yet built a quieter cage. Once addiction was classified as a chronic, relapsing condition, autonomy became suspect. The individual could never again be fully trusted with choice. Once an addict, always an addict, echoed the older theology of guilt, replacing damnation with diagnosis. The framing carried the same paternal logic as Prohibition: safety through surrender. As discussed earlier, Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935, embodied that contradiction. Fellowship was achieved through confession, liberation through obedience. Its central ritual, the spoken declaration, "I am an addict," reenacted religious penance, binding identity to affliction. For many, such structures offers salvation. For others, it recreates dependency under a therapeutic name, repeating the cycle of authority that both medicine and morality claim to end. From a wider lens, addiction itself became a system, not just a state. Alexander reframed it as the pathology of dislocation, the predictable outcome of societies that fracture connection. When bonds to families, place and purpose collapse, the brain seeks chemical substitutes. In that sense, addiction is not the opposite of sobriety, but of belonging. The term disease hides that social wound behind the skin of the individual. Insights from a forthcoming book that I'm writing, Physics, Conscious and Reality, which will be out soon, sharpen this point. Just as perception filters the world through models built by the mind, so science filters suffering through models built by culture. We mistake the map for the territory. Addiction, like particle or self, is a conceptual lens, useful but not absolute. The body's craving loops and the psyche's search for meaning are entangled systems, not separate faults. The illusion of independence, so central to both capitalism and psychiatry, creates the very hunger it later seeks to cure. The medicalisation of compulsion also served the state. The addict could be confined, medicated, studied, and made an object of expertise. Treatment centres mirrored factories, intake, processing, discharge. Recovery often meant reintegration into the same economic order that had produced the wound. Even neuroscience, with its talk of dopamine hijacks and reward circuits, repeats the old Puritan suspicion of pleasure. See section 24. The brain scan replaces the sermon, but not its tone. Yet within the framework lies seeds of liberation. The recognition that craving has a structure, that it follows rules, allows those rules to be rewritten. When we see addiction not as moral weakness or lifelong disease, but as learned adaptation, agency returns. This is where modern trauma theory, community-based recovery, and psychedelic therapy converge. They treat the addict not as broken, but as over-defended, a consciousness looping on itself for safety. As we suggest in our book to come on physics, consciousness and reality, the mind's capacity for illusion is not error, but survival strategy. Healing means updating the model, not destroying it. The invention of addiction, then, was both a scientific milestone and a cultural sleight of hand. It shifted discourse from pulpit to clinic, yet the underlying premise that someone else must authorise your experience remained. The next historical move, explored in Chapter 4, will take this logic global, from the asylum to the international stage, where treatment becomes geopolitics and medicine merges with policing. But before that escalation, it is worth pausing here to recognise that every system of control begins as a story about care. So the issue was never simply the drugs themselves. Prohibition emerged from a system that wanted productive workers, obedient citizens, and clear social boundaries. Drug laws became one way to regulise behaviour and reinforce hierarchy. Once we see the pattern, the debate changes. The question is no longer just which substances are dangerous, but which we gets to decide which states of consciousness are allowed. And if prohibition was never really about health, then what happens? Then societies start questioning the authority behind the rules. So in the next chapter, we'll start looking at addiction, as section 28, addiction as hijacked transcendence.